PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors of books about Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk with Alan Dieterich-Ward about his book, Cradle of Conservation.
This week on PA Books, Alan Dieterich-Ward, author of Cradle of Conservation.
Alan Dieterich-Ward is the author of Cradle of Conservation, An Environmental History of Pennsylvania. One of the key terms that you use in the book is working landscape. What do you mean by that?
So the notion of a working landscape is absolutely key to understanding Cradle of Conservation, right? So much of when we think of nature, when we think of the environment, we think of these kind of untouched, unspoiled landscapes. And as problematic as that notion is, right? I mean, who lived in those untouched landscapes before they became untouched? The reality is that when we're looking at some place like Pennsylvania, you can't divorce human culture from nature as some sort of abstract. And so the notion of a working landscape really underscores that fact that there are always layer upon layers of human involvement in natural places. And the working part of it is that these landscapes do work, right, for humans. Human work is embedded in those landscapes. There are products, there are results that come from those places. And of course, then succeeding generations are left with landscapes that bear the social costs or the social consequences of the work that was done on those landscapes before. They're never untouched, right? They are always sort of tipped in a particular direction. Now, the other part of working landscapes and the other kind of work that gets done on those landscapes is the landscape of the mind, right? When we think about Pennsylvania, right, you close your eyes, you imagine, what does Pennsylvania mean to me? And those landscapes of the mind that help us to forge our identity, both as individuals and as residents of the Commonwealth, that is part of a working landscape as well. What kind of intellectual work, what kind of cultural work do those particular landscapes do? When I say the Poconos, for example, right? Or I say the Laurel Highlands, or I say 3 Mile Island, right? Or I say the anthracite fields. All of those landscapes come with a particular material element, a physicality, but they also come with a particular kind of intellectual framework, an intellectual work, right, that is mobilized politically, culturally, socially, and each new generation then does its own work on those landscapes and sort of reframing it, rethinking about it for their needs going forward.
Well, one of those key concepts of landscape is this idea of wilderness, that the Europeans arrive and there's this untouched nature, but it wasn't untouched. There were people living here, and how did the Native Americans who were living in what is now Pennsylvania shape the landscape?
Fascinating, right? One of the most interesting things I think about studying Pennsylvania is the diversity of landscapes that it provides, right? And that, of course, goes all the way back for tens of thousands of years. Unlike sort of other states or areas that are kind of formed around a particular watershed or a particular style of landscape, Pennsylvania has a number of different watersheds, a number of different landscapes, from kind of the fertile flat lands of the east to the mountains of the Alleghenies to the broken Appalachian Plateau of the west. And just like those landscapes divide us up into Eagles fans, Steelers fans, and Ravens fans, it also divided up the experiences of Native peoples who arrived on those landscapes tens of thousands of years before Europeans. In the north, particularly early on as the glaciers were receding, this was a landscape that was really dominated by hunting and kind of brief agricultural windows. Lots of the agricultural goods and other goods that these folks received were from trade with folks farther to the south, right? To the west, This is really where agriculture develops in the kind of upper reaches of the Ohio River Valley. And those communities, kind of from places like Moundsville in what is now West Virginia, up through the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, kind of early on, those communities were really the first to adopt agricultural practices that sort of move slowly across the continent. In the east, and remember, over the course of 10,000 years or so, as glaciers receded, the coastline of what's now eastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, was much farther out into the Atlantic Ocean, and is what's now the Atlantic Ocean than it is now. But these were a people who, particularly once they adopted agriculture, tended to move among different sites, right? More interior meadows for growing corn, for growing beans, for growing squash, the adoption of sunflowers, other kinds of goods. You see in the springtime these folks moving to the rivers and to the ocean for the spring spawning runs, for fishing, etc., and then moving into the more sheltered valleys in the autumn and for the winter. So there's this diversity of experiences really that are shaped by the landscape that native peoples endured long before the arrival of Europeans. It's important to keep in mind, though, of course, that native peoples weren't simply responding to the natural world; they were reshaping it themselves over many years. Agriculture in Pennsylvania was really supported by regular burns of the landscape, right, which would clear off underbrush, and create fertilizers through the ash that then supported growing. And when Europeans arrived, while they did bring with them certain agricultural practices from the countries that they were from, they also tended to adopt many Native American, sort of long-tested Native American ways of interacting with the landscape. For example, doing regular burns of the ground to increase berry harvests in subsequent years, right? So these have been working landscapes. It was not this pristine wilderness that Europeans encountered, but rather generations of working landscapes from native peoples.
Now, one of the concepts that is long part of American history is the frontier, and this idea of people kind of on the edge of civilization. How does that reality and the kind of reality that the settlers would have had shape their concepts of environment? Yeah,
that's a great question. So I would put it in two different ways, right? There are pretty early on these two different kinds of landscapes that emerge. There's the landscape that we, of course, associate with this colonial era, this era of conquest and of expansion, in which Europeans encountered a landscape of native peoples that had long been disrupted. European diseases, European trade predated by more than a century kind of the first arrival of people, well, the first certainly arrival of English people in what would become Pennsylvania. Native communities had been disrupted already. And Europeans took advantage of that to kind of move in relatively quickly into lands that had been previously, been populated by a variety of different native groups. The notion of the frontier is sort of a quirky one when we talk particularly about the early period of Pennsylvania. You see settlements in the east that are kind of spreading into the interior. And there are kind of two kinds of landscapes that are associated with that expansion. One is agricultural landscapes, right? And these agricultural landscapes, in the words of one kind of prominent historian of farming in Pennsylvania, were scruffy and unkempt, right? They were landscapes in which labor was really at a premium. And so rather than the kind of labor-intensive practices of fertilization, of using animals, of sort of maintaining the same field for year after year that we would have seen in more established agricultural communities in Europe. Instead, you see kind of this process of girdling trees, growing corn and other crops kind of in among, sort of half-cleared wood areas and sort of getting along. Now, very quickly, though, of course, you do see a shift toward, toward a market economy, right? So even with folks who are kind of subsisting, or who are primarily growing subsistence crops, they are already looking toward the Atlantic marketplace for particular kinds of crops. Hemp, linen, wheat early on, right? And it's important, of course, to remember that the real centers of economic growth in the Americas in the 1600s and 1700s were in the Caribbean, where they were growing crops that you couldn't grow in Europe, like sugar particularly, right? And those were worked largely by enslaved people, certainly by 1650, 1700. And rather than growing food crops in those areas, it was most economically advantageous for them to grow these trade crops in the Caribbean and then purchase wheat and other food goods from places like Pennsylvania. Now, in addition to those kind of agricultural landscapes kind of out in the hinterland, there is also very early on these industrial landscapes, the charcoal plantation, right? The production of iron. Iron production in this period was largely a rural affair because it was required an enormous amount of lumber, right? And so it was much easier to kind of make the iron and then ship the finished products back to the colonial cities, back to areas for distribution, than it was to kind of to ship large amounts of lumber and of iron ore to the city, right? So these are these colonial iron plantations were this other industrial landscape in the hinterland. Again, here, much of the work that is done on these iron plantations is done by enslaved people, right? These are difficult jobs, and particularly when land is kind of available, free people are not particularly willing to do those jobs for the kind of pay that the iron masters are willing to present. The other landscape, of course, and this is one that I think is a fascinating one, is the very early urban landscape, particularly of Philadelphia, right? The urban landscape in Philadelphia was established by Penn, who was just coming out of the Great Fire of London. And so he was really imagining this green country town, this vision of God's kingdom on earth, planned, efficient, and wholesome for people. Now, very quickly, much of that vision was disrupted by the reality of living in a colonial community, right? You have very primitive septic systems, of course. This is also a community in which much of the produce of the interior is being shipped to and then being transferred or translated into finished goods, particularly leather goods. Leather goods during this period of time was an incredibly disgusting, messy affair, and much of the effluent, much of the chemicals used in that leather production end up in places like Dock Creek. Benjamin Franklin is kind of seen as is kind of Pennsylvania's first environmentalist because of his early kind of opposition to the kinds of industrial waste that was flowing into the Dock Creek, right where near his community was. And one of the very last things he did in his will was to set aside funds of his own estate for the development of drinking water, of clean water, because of this kind of very quick and early pollution that we see in Philadelphia.
Now, part of the key parts of the story include transportation networks as well. And throughout Pennsylvania history, everything from roads to railroads, canals, all served as different types of networks, and then they also, all of them, each in their own way, affected the landscape around them. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about some of those differences and how they impacted the landscape?
Absolutely. And this is a really important story, I think. If we think holistically, one of the arguments that I make in Cradle of Conservation is that if we're going to understand the evolution of conservation and environmental policy in the United States, that it's much more useful to look at some place like Pennsylvania or like the Mid-Atlantic more broadly, where you have this combination of kind of rural, forested areas, but then also urban areas, right, where people are not going to make any sort of claim that, well, we're going to preserve these landscapes untouched, right, these are working landscapes. One of the big differences, of course, over time between Pennsylvania and New York is exactly the issue that you're underscoring. Because of the natural lay of the ground in Pennsylvania versus New York, there is no easy east-west transportation corridor in Pennsylvania like there is in New York in the Hudson River Valley and the Mohawk River Valley. That's the corridor that's eventually going to become the Erie Canal. That's the corridor that's eventually going to allow New York City to overtake Philadelphia as the real capital, commercial capital of the United States of America. That ability, that kind of landscape that allows for this east-west transportation network in New York doesn't exist in Pennsylvania, right? The main river system that we think of in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's main watershed, which extends throughout a big portion of the state, is the Susquehanna River watershed, right? But the Susquehanna River watershed doesn't lead to a Philadelphia city, it leads to Baltimore, right? And so unlike in New York State, you kind of early on have this competition between different cities, Baltimore and Philadelphia. Pittsburgh, of course, is not easily connected to Philadelphia. It's out in the west, on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. Pittsburgh is kind of generally more oriented toward the south and to the west, to this new territory, in the Ohio River Valley. And this puts Philadelphia at a real disadvantage, particularly once the Erie Canal gets built. Instead, Philadelphians look to build this sort of cobbled together transportation system that we call the Main Line, which ends up being a combination of canals and incline planes, which are sort of a combination between railroads and elevators, right, that sort of lift you over the Appalachian Mountains, but in a way that is much, much less efficient and effective than the Erie Canal is. Now, on the other hand, this inability for canals to really become this effective long-distance transportation corridor for Pennsylvania, this drives the political and economic leaders of Pennsylvania to look to alternatives. And those alternatives are the railroads. You see major innovations in the 1830s and 1840s in Pennsylvania in railroad technology. Philadelphia becomes a leading city for railroad engine production, right? And you see the founding of what is going to become the largest corporation in the world, the Pennsylvania Railroad, which has a budget second only to that of the United States government itself. And so this need to develop a long-distance transportation network to kind of knit the state together in a way that is not easily possible kind of with the artificial river that are canals, becomes this spur to technological development that leads Pennsylvania to kind of corporate development of the railroad.
Now, two towns that you highlight, Hollidaysburg and Altoona, represent different ways that landscape is shaped by transportation. So Hollidaysburg by the canal and Altoona by the railroad. Can you talk about those two towns?
Yeah, Hollidaysburg is an absolutely fascinating community. It becomes really the great inland port for a brief time, right, for a few decades, becomes this great inland port, right, which serves, I think, one canal boat every 20 minutes or something like that in its heyday. It's marked by early travelers to Hollidaysburg sort of remarked upon this enormous pool, man-made pool, that served to water the canal, right, the mainline canal, and to transport these boats, through Hollidaysburg and then past Hollidaysburg through to the rest of the mainline system. Charles Dickens kind of famously travels this transportation network in one of his trips to the United States, and talks about how a trip that previously would have taken weeks or even months gets accomplished in a couple of days. He says, he kind of sets out from Harrisburg, and within a few days is hearing the whir and the clang of industry that marked his arrival to Pittsburgh. Not very far away at all, Hollidaysburg is kind of this vision of the canal era, not very far away at all, and I think that this underscores how kind of briefly the canal era really lasted in Pennsylvania, is the development of Altoona. And really the reason for both Hollidaysburg and Altoona is that they are at this place in this east-west transportation network where you have this need to get over the spine of the Allegheny Mountains in a way that is kind of simply not possible with a canal. This is the reason why we have those tunnels on the turnpike, right? Even with automobiles driving up over the spine of the Appalachian Mountains, of the Allegheny Mountains, is not particularly easy. So Altoona is a company town from the Pennsylvania Railroad. It is at the base of this transportation link that's going to become the Horseshoe Curve, which allows for this new Pennsylvania Railroad, instead of having to use kind of the innovative but relatively cumbersome mechanism of the inclined planes of Allegheny Portage, to instead have a through route, this kind of massive engineering marvel that is Horseshoe Curve, to get over the Allegheny Mountains. Altoona, of course, develops as this railroad town. It explodes in population very, very, very quickly, becoming one of the largest cities for a time in Pennsylvania, and becoming, for more than a century, this hub of railroad activity. I have a railroad museum in Shippensburg, where I live and work, in which both of the cars sort of emerged out of this industrial complex, both of the rail cars out of this industrial complex that is Hollidaysburg and Altoona, because they were part of this Pennsylvania Penn Central Railroad network. I can't understate how significant the Pennsylvania Railroad becomes to understanding Pennsylvania's environmental history as well as its political and cultural history.
Now, another key factor was the timber industry. And not only do you have the iron industry cutting down trees, turn it into charcoal, but then the timber industry itself just to provide raw materials.
Yeah.
Talk about that and how they use rivers to transport the logs.
Sure. Yeah. So you're absolutely right to point out that there's this sort of evolution of how and what timber is used for in Pennsylvania. And it becomes the absolute mainstay of early wealth generation in the 19th century in Pennsylvania, particularly, right? Gifford Pinchot's family, who Pinchot is going to become the father of U.S. forestry. His family moved to northeastern Pennsylvania following the Napoleonic Wars. His grandfather was a supporter of, of one of the factions in the Napoleonic Wars that kind of was forced out. His family makes their wealth on buying and selling vast amounts of timber in Pennsylvania and later in Michigan. So the first big use, as you note, of timber is really for industrial use, is for charcoal, right, in these furnaces. As the shift in iron making and steel production shifts away from charcoal and to anthracite and bituminous coal, the need for timber also shifts in a different way. It ends up being used for industrial uses, mine timbers to hold mine roofs up for coal mining. All of those hundreds and hundreds of thousands of railroad ties, right, that are supporting the railroad, the iron and then the steel rails. Pennsylvania timber is also used for building all of those houses out on the prairie, on the treeless prairies, right? You see Pennsylvania kind of lumber being shipped to build buildings, right? What's interesting about timber production, I think, too, is the way in which it goes hand in hand with the development of the railroads, right? Railroads become a real user of timber for heating the boilers on early locomotives, again for tracks, but then also the ability to build tracks into those more remote areas, particularly of the northern and western parts of the state, allow for the harvesting and extraction of timber in ways that never was possible before, right? And so you have this real industry, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, headquartered in Williamsport, that while it kind of begins with shipping logs on the rivers, kind of the famous Williamsport Susquehanna log boom, it goes hand in hand with the development of railroads, and eventually over time the railroads come to supplant the rivers as the main transportation system for kind of getting that timber off the ground and into the hands, and into the marketplace. The other big innovation, of course, is that as you have the use of steam power, you also see innovations in the ability to harvest, power saws, in the ability to load logs. One of the biggest innovations in the industry is the automatic log loader, which allows, which massively increases the amount of timber that can be actually, kind of taken from a pile and put onto a train and shipped out. So it's really that period. As much as we think of kind of the charcoal plantations as being as kind of clearing the land, the reality is that the scale of charcoal plantations is much less than what we see in the late 19th century and kind of just the clear cutting of the northern forests. Also, of course, if we want to think about it this way, the charcoal plantations required a sustainable harvest, right? They had to have wood not just for 1 year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, but for the lifetime of the charcoal plantation. And so in some ways, what's later going to become kind of this notion of sustainable forestry, sustainable harvesting, as part of the conservation movement, actually emerges out of the view of those earlier charcoal plantations on the need to maintain a harvest over many decades. That is kind of in contrast to the real clear cutting that we see of kind of entire mountainsides in the late 19th century in northern Pennsylvania.
So if we were to look at Pennsylvania in, say, the 1890s, how extensive was the deforestation at that time?
Very extensive. I mean, massively, right? So enormous portions. I mean, in that area that becomes the Allegheny National Forest, for example, kind of in northern, in north central and western Pennsylvania, there are descriptions of just kind of absolute devastation, right? And the trick too is that when you kind of that these mountainsides are not well suited to not having forest cover, right? I mean, they are steep, right? They are rocky. The soil is often quite thin. Those tree roots and the branches that are kind of slowing down, rain, those are the only things that are kind of holding the sediment on those mountainsides. And so what happens is that when you see the harvesting of these kind of harder to reach, more difficult to reach rocky places, that's going to cause massive massive runoff, right? Massive sedimentation running into rivers, water pollution, as well as massive forest fires, right? We see massive forest fires. Much of the discussion that we have today of the ways in which brush and other burnables that lay dry on the ground in places like California, sort of transforming what might be kind of small smoldering fires into these conflagrations of tens or hundreds of thousands of acres, that is really what we see in the late 19th century, again, particularly in northern Pennsylvania. This combination of kind of runoff, non-sustainable harvesting practices, right, as an economic issue, and forest fires, that's really what's going to drive the conservation movement in terms of forestry in Pennsylvania.
Well, let's talk more about the conservation movement. At what point in the 19th century did people start being concerned about how the natural environment was being impacted?
Sure. I think what I would say is that people are always concerned about nature, right? I mean, it's at what point do we see enough people with enough power coming together with a particular vision of what to do, right? That's really when we see the conservation movement emerge. And that happens, that particular combination actually happens in places like, particularly in places like Philadelphia and Harrisburg, where you have kind of well-connected, wealthy, right, politically powerful people whose family wealth may have come from harvesting resources, but that now are not directly are often not directly connected to those industries, or are connected to those industries in a way that their goal is really to see sustainability over a long term, rather than sort of the extraction and then walk away from it practices that we see in the late 19th century. And this is really what we see with the formation of the Pennsylvania Forestry Association. The main driver of conservation public policy in Pennsylvania forms in this period, actually in Philadelphia, And it comes out of a combination of women and men in positions of power who have this vision of what a sustainable conservation ethic should be, and are then able to mobilize around that sustainable conservation ethic and get it put into public policy at a time when, by and large, kind of the conservatism of the state legislature does make it difficult for those policies to kind of get enacted. It takes a big push, and it takes a big push from people who are well connected and both politically and economically in order to get that to happen.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Now, one of the key figures was Joseph Rothrock. Who was he, and what impact did he have on this movement?
Sure. Joseph Rothrock was a medical doctor, lived in Westchester, right? And was a botanist and a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Okay. He gave a series of lectures, annual lectures, at the University of Pennsylvania called the Michaud Lectures, right? And they increasingly, over time, they were named after they really started out of botany. They were named after a famous French botanist named André Michaud, who left some funds for these lectures over time. And it kind of started as this botany, kind of traditional, science, kind of looking at identifying new flowers and identifying new plant species. But over time, and particularly under Rothrock, increasingly came to talk about the need for some kind of protection of the natural world. And two women in particular, kind of well-connected socialites, Maria Cox and Mary Lundy, were at one of these Michaud lectures. And they were kind of so moved by Rothrock's description that they called a meeting of kind of fellow connected women in Philadelphia at the Cox family home that evolved into the Pennsylvania Forestry Association. Now, these two women are really interesting, and their story has not been told very effectively. Everybody kind of focuses on Rothrock, rightfully so. But Maria Cox and Mary Lundy are really fascinating in their own right. Maria Cox was married to Brinton Cox. Brinton Cox was a lawyer in Philadelphia. He was actually an early president of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and in fact, the founding meeting of the Pennsylvania Forestry Association was in the main building of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. So there's kind of this connection between history and conservation kind of from the very beginning. His family owned the largest coal mine in the anthracite fields of Pennsylvania. His brother, and you may recognize this name, Eckley Cox, right, was the brother who managed the family's coal holdings. Eckley Miners Village, right, that the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission now manages, was named after Eckley Cox, right? So this is a family, much like Gifford Pinchot's family, that is very wealthy, well-connected, urban, right, well-educated, but has this notion that that for the long-term economic benefit of the state, that natural resources need to be managed in a way so that they are not sort of exhausted inefficiently, right? Now, Mary Lundy is a different story. She is married to the Reverend James Lundy, who is a prominent Episcopalian minister in Philadelphia. He actually, and in New York City. There's a lot of connections between Philadelphia and New York City. And he really comes from this view of kind of and they really come from this view of kind of the spiritual nature, the regenerating power of nature as kind of God's cathedral, right? And when we think back kind of nationally, the kind of Muir and Pinchot dynamic that we see in the origins of the conservation movement nationally, they are really here in Pennsylvania too, in the persons of the Cox family and the Lundy family. The Lundys vacationed in the Adirondacks, just like the Pinchos did, right? James Lundy, Reverend James Lundy, kind of publishes this memoir of how his time in the Adirondacks kind of refreshes and revives and restores him. So you put those two pieces together, right? This notion of an efficient use of resources with the notion that it is a moral imperative to preserve God's cathedral. That is a powerful motivating factor for conservationism in Pennsylvania. And those two strands are sort of embedded in the Pennsylvania Forestry Association from the very beginning.
Now, if we move to the 1930s, we're in the midst of the Great Depression at that point. Can you talk about what the New Deal was and how it impacted landscape in Pennsylvania?
Absolutely. So there are a couple of threads here, and I'll try to pick up a couple of the most important ones. So from a political perspective, Gifford Pinchot, right, who is a real important figure on the national stage for conservation. Again, he was really kind of the nation's chief forester. He's one of the first trained foresters in the United States. His family establishes the first forestry school, the Yale Forestry School in the United States of America. And also he's involved in the development of Pennsylvania's Forest Academy, now Penn State Mont Alto, which is kind of the second, significant public forestry school in the United States. But Pinchot's focus is really on the national level, right? He has national ambitions. He considers a run for president. He has an unsuccessful run for Senate. He is governor of Pennsylvania kind of in the 1920s. But his first kind of, first time around, the progressivism that Gifford Pinchot is associated with is kind of out of favor in the 1920s. It's when Gifford Pinchot kind of comes out of retirement and becomes governor again in the 1930s that his view of kind of the role of government in supporting conservation really gets created in Pennsylvania. He becomes close friends with or allies with the Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the governor of New York State. And when Pinchot comes to office, again, he is a Republican. He is a progressive, right? He is conservative in a lot of ways, particularly in terms of prohibition, in which we are still living with Pinchot's legacy today. But in terms of kind of seeing the ability of the government, and particularly of sustainable harvesting of natural resources as a way to put unemployed people to work, to serve the greater good, Pinchot brings those ideas with him into office. The progenitor of what is going to become the Civilian Conservation Corps that Roosevelt develops when he's elected president is really established by Pinchot early on in his term by putting unemployed men to work and on cutting firewood for needy families, right? Pinchot's role, those of you who are like me from outside of Pennsylvania, one of the first things you're struck by when you're kind of driving in rural Pennsylvania are the fact that we actually have really good roads in a lot of rural areas of Pennsylvania. Those were because Pinchot realized that one of the things the state could do would be to provide direct funding for farmers to get their goods to market. And so he gets the state legislature to pass creating state oversight of these Pinchot roads. The other piece then is this federalization then of the efforts that Pinchot begins, both in terms of road development in what's going to become federal oversight for interstate highways later on. Pinchot initiates discussions on what is going to become the Pennsylvania Turnpike eventually by the end of the 1930s, which then becomes a model for the interstate highway system. And then the Civilian Conservation Corps kind of coming out of this model that Pinchot had developed early on in his term becomes this really big program in which Pennsylvania has one of the largest numbers of Civilian Conservation Corps projects in the United States. These folks are put to work developing forest roads, stringing electrical line in rural areas, establishing what is later on going to become state parks. I look at one state park in what's going to become Penn Roosevelt State Park in the book. It's the Civilian Conservation Corps is segregated, right? And so you have these really important units of the Civilian Conservation Corps, both in state forest lands, but then also in places like Gettysburg, in which you see enormous conservation efforts in developing natural resources for the public good that are then going to have impacts that extend all the way through to today.
So early in the first half of the 20th century, of course, is characterized by two world wars. How would their demands for resources and the type of work that needed to be done, how did they impact Pennsylvania's landscape?
Yeah, that's a great question. The lumber production in Pennsylvania, for example, really surged, as does coal, really surges during World War I, and then kind of crashes right after. Probably, I think, one of the biggest consequences of World War I in particular is changes to the agricultural landscape. So in the lead up to World War I, kind of 1910 to 1916 or so, with Europe being kind of in flames, there is this enormous demand for American agricultural products and Pennsylvania agricultural products to ship to these kind of to ship for the forces in Europe. And what that's actually going to do is cause a lot of Pennsylvania farmers who want to scale up their land, to scale up their production, to invest in machinery, right? This is when we start to see the first tractors being introduced that replace horses. This is when we're going to see, an expansion of steam-powered threshing. We're going to see new kinds of reaping and harvesting equipment, from John Deere and International Harvester and others. That's all great, but it's expensive. And so farmers take out loans in order to be able to invest in new machinery and also to invest in new land. And so you see the number of the number of acres per farm sort of really expanding during this period as farmers are acquiring other lands, oftentimes for people who have left and gone to the cities for industrial work. With the beginning of the 1920s and sort of the resurgence of European agriculture, this dynamic absolutely crashes, right? And so you see this huge wave of foreclosures in farms, farmers going bankrupt, and this is going to have a significant impact that carries through with us today on the Pennsylvania landscape. Many of these farms were in what we think of as marginal areas for agriculture. And there isn't demand, with the lack of demand overall, there isn't really a push to maintain those areas as agricultural landscapes. And so oftentimes they revert to forest. And in many cases, they are actually purchased by the state at sheriff sales, at tax delinquency sales, and then become parts of this new state forest system that we have, right? If you go out to any of our state forests and you know what to look for, you're going to see a lot of abandoned farmlands that are now kind of part of these state forests. Okay, so we do see this major shift in the landscape for agriculture because of this. Also, obviously, we see a major increase in industrialization, both around World War I and around World War II. In the meantime, with that, this kind of collapse in industry because of the Great Depression. So that's going to have real consequences as we get to the end of World War II, and there are these questions of, well, what is Pennsylvania going to look like after this 20 years of real shock and shift? What is that post-war period going to look like? That's a broader national story, of course, but it's one that plays out here in Pennsylvania in shaping what the post-war landscape is going to look like.
Now, one of the key factors that shapes the post-war landscape is the rise of the automobile.
Indeed.
How does that affect people's experience of nature and experience of the outdoor world?
That's a great question. And it's both a practical one, a material one. Again, when we think of working landscapes, there's this material concept or component, but then there's also this cultural component, right? And so the impact of the automobile actually starts decades earlier, in the 1910s and 1920s. Early on, of course, the development of state forests is really about production, right? It is about the state managing and controlling, using this new profession of forestry to maintain sustainable output of timber over the long term, right? To protect from sedimentation, to protect from runoff, to protect from forest fires, but really to maintain production over the long term. When you have the development of the automobile, however, you also see this shift toward a desire to use public lands for recreation, right? For people who may be living in the cities, but want to be able to get out to the country and have a place to recreate, whether that is fishing, whether that is hunting, whether that is hiking. You know, this is the 1920s are really when we see the emergence of the Appalachian Trail, for example, and these other kind of hiking systems. You see this democratization of leisure time in the 1920s, and thus then a demand for more recreational opportunities. While what are going to become the state park system does emerge kind of very early in the 1890s, the same year that the first state forests are authorized. That's the same year that the state takes over Valley Forge, which is originally a state park. It becomes federalized at the bicentennial, but is originally a state park. During this period, you see increasing numbers of state parks that are created to serve these automobile campers, right? These folks who want to, for a weekend, get out into the country and experience nature. That notion, that trend, is going to be sort of dramatically increased following World War II, right? As new highways and roads are developed, as the union movement in the United States sort of negotiates the 8-hour workday, vacation pay and vacation time for people, more and more what we think of as working or middle class people are going to have leisure time. And what they want to do increasingly with their leisure time is to get out of the urban or suburban spaces and get out into the countryside. And so the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s sees this explosion of state parks in Pennsylvania, right? So there's this, one of this is kind of sort of this cultural notion of recreating, of leisure, of enjoyment of nature. Now, this goes hand in hand with the development of the suburbs, right? Because the real promise of the suburbs is that you can have the convenience of urban life, right? With the healthful benefits, with the social benefits of nature, of a rural life. If you look at the advertisements for Levittown, for Pennsylvania's Levittown, right? This kind of sort of ultimate iconic suburban development. These are leafy, ranch-style houses with kind of leafy green trees around them, right? And so folks who are moving to this suburb are moving there with this notion that they will be living in a landscape that is healthy, that is bucolic, that is green. Of course, what they often discover is not that, right? Because of problems with septic systems, right? You have mucky backyards that develop, right? Because of everyone driving an automobile, you have people stuck in hazy, smoky, lead-filled highways going back and forth to work, right? Because of the rapid development of communities, what might have been early on a farm field, within 2 years of me moving to my home, now those people next door are living in what had been a farm field. And so we see here this increasing demand for public spaces that are set aside for the enjoyment of Pennsylvanians. We also see the kind of burbling undercurrents of what's going to become the environmental movement. A movement that really emerges not just out of like the conservation movement, which is kind of about efficient use of natural resources and kind of a spiritual understanding of the woods, those two components, but about public health, recreation, leisure, and this notion that you can't separate nature from humans, that they are involved in this kind of ecological web of life, like Rachel Carson talks about, that needs to be protected in order for humans to be protected as well.
Who was Maurice Goddard?
Maurice Goddard was this fascinating guy. He is a trained forester. He serves in World War II and returns and becomes a forester first at the Forest Academy at Mont Alto, and then eventually at Penn State itself. Okay, early in the mid-1950s, the Pennsylvania governor is considering how to remake this what had been this traditionally separate focus on forests and waters into this Department of Forests and Waters, and he reaches out to Goddard as this academic, right, at Penn State, and asks him for advice on, who should he pick to staff this. He's so impressed by Maurice Goddard that he names Goddard as his secretary of this new department. And Goddard sets out with this vision of professionalizing this Department of Forests and Waters, of getting away from local foresters and local forestry officials being kind of the nephews of Republican committeemen in a community, right? But instead to professionalize that forestry and to take their jobs seriously, right? So he really implements this kind of discipline into the Department of Forests and Waters. And he launches very early on this ambitious program of the development of state parks in Pennsylvania. One of the earliest things he does is to help negotiate the passage of a law that will assign royalties from oil and gas wells on public land to be assigned to developing new state forest and camp and parklands, under the notion that if things are taken out of the public sphere through the extraction of oil and gas, that there should be a balance, and that other benefits should then be applied, right? So Goddard and his team at Forests and Waters set out with this vision, very much based on the development of highways and of automobiles, to develop a state park within 25 miles of every Pennsylvanian. They don't quite achieve that, right? But it is a vision that really resonates with Pennsylvanians of the 1950s and 1960s, right? Goddard has a vision of all state parks as having some kind of lake, right? Of having these amenities that are going to allow urban and suburban people to appreciate kind of the bounties of nature, and of course then provide political support for the broader conservation vision that he has, right? Over the course of the 1960s, Goddard spearheads a number of different absolutely vital campaigns. One called Project 70, right? And one called Project 500, both of which are aimed at public bond issues for developing new public lands. Project 70 results in the creation of some of the most iconic state parks in Pennsylvania, including Ohiopyle. And Project 500, which, among other things, focuses on remediation of industrial landscapes from the coal, from the timber, from the oil eras, particularly remediating landscapes that are affected by acid mine drainage. This just enormous swath, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres and tens of thousands of sort of waterways from small to large throughout Pennsylvania that are damaged by acid mine drainage and now have no way to be cleaned because the mines are long gone. These two bond issues in the 1960s, really spearheaded by Maurice Goddard, set the stage for what is going to be an environmental revolution in the late 1960s and early 1970s.
Talk more about that environmental revolution. You call it a golden age, and then at some point it comes to an end. But what was going on politically and socially that enabled that to happen, and then why did that cease? Yeah,
it's a fascinating story, and it's one that, again, as an environmental historian, I'm very familiar with and we're taught this story on the national level, right? The ways in which polling demonstrates an enormously high percentage of Americans are in favor of environmental regulation, and kind of this very rapid shift towards support for environmental regulation, such that even kind of conservative Republicans like Richard Nixon get on board with it. I mean, after all, many of the most important kind of key environmental regulations that shape the regulatory state today were passed during the Nixon administration, right? But the story here in Pennsylvania, while it is known in some circles, is not nearly as widely known as it should be, right? We have our own environmental revolution here in Pennsylvania, and it begins from some of those dynamics that I've just been talking about, right? This notion that that suburban sprawl is increasingly making it difficult for Pennsylvanians to access natural amenities, right? Literally, the farm fields, the forests are kind of getting farther and farther away from people as you see the sprawl of metropolitan areas, right? The increased desire among people to use their leisure time in rural areas, particularly in public spaces like state parks, right? The notion that our waterways are polluted and are becoming increasingly polluted, and that the laws that are on the books always have this exception for the coal industry, right? Or never go quite far enough to actually creating clean air or clean water. And you have this moment in the late 1960s where all of these different elements come together, and you get a political consensus. It is driven by sort of the Democratic Party sort of taking both eventually taking both the Pennsylvania House and the Senate. But this is a widespread political consensus that something needs to be done, right? There are these, when we think nationally about sort of these big name national environmental disasters like the Cuyahoga River fires, right, or the Santa Barbara oil spill, we have those same things that happen here in Pennsylvania. In particular, right, in the early 1960s, we see some significant mine disaster underneath of the Susquehanna River that then eventually, through a number of twists, turns into a massive fish kill from acid mine drainage along the Susquehanna River that mobilizes conservative people, conservationists, fly fishermen, hunters, and others to join together with academics, with scientists, to fight very obvious environmental problems that have no other mechanism existing to solve. And you see the election of a couple of key people. One of them is Franklin Curry, who is a Democrat from Sunbury, who runs on a platform of clean politics and clean water, really coming out of this Susquehanna River disaster. You see John Laudaudio, who is an electrical engineer at Westinghouse, who his political base of support is the Pennsylvania Federation of Sportsmen's Clubs, right? He is a blue-collar industrial guy for a major manufacturer, but his leisure time is spent in hunting and fishing, right? And so these groups come together, rural people, urban people, suburban people, around this notion that something needs to be done about the environment. Now, this is happening at a time, I should say, when some of the traditional power brokers, particularly in the coal industry, are losing some of their political clout, right? The anthracite industry is nowhere near as powerful as it had been in previous decades. And so one of the first parts of this environmental revolution is a revamping of the Clean Streams Act, or I should say Pennsylvania's Clean Streams Law, which really puts some teeth into it and gets rid of the exemptions for acid mine drainage, right? Coming off of that, then, you have a whole series of laws, the Pennsylvania Scenic Rivers Law, laws dealing with solid waste management, laws dealing with wildlife protection. You see the real enhancement of the both the Fish and Boat Commission, what's going to become the Fish and Boat Commission, and the Pennsylvania Game Commission, the removal of bounties on bobcats, right? So there's this kind of whole series of laws really between 68 and 74 that are part of this environmental revolution.
We've been speaking with Alan Dieterich-Ward. He is the author of Cradle of Conservation, an Environmental History of Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining me.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.